Dr. Brammertz, thank you very much indeed again for your time. So you're in Rwanda again for the umpteenth time, but this time it's slightly different, I think, than the previous occasions. You're heading to a different way of working with the mechanism and the local prosecutors, or are you? Could you explain what this trip was about?
Yeah, sure. As you know, I'm coming 5 or 6 times per year over the last few years. In the past, it was mainly in relation to our own cases, Kabuga, Mpiranya, Kaishima, and others. But as you know, we don't have cases anymore before our jurisdiction. So the reasons I'm coming is, on one hand, to inform, obviously, my counterpart, the Prosecutor General, about the progress or the absence of progress in the transfer of Kaishima, who is still in South Africa after his arrest in May last year. But I'm also here because we had the last few days, and they're still in the country, the anti-terrorism prosecutor from Paris, because we have some cases where we are all 3 offices working on, where the prosecutors in Paris are working on, the Prosecutor General Rwanda, and myself. So it was also about to see how we coordinate our work, how we cooperated to make sure that all information is coming at one place. But you are right, it's a new phase. We don't have our own cases anymore. The field office, which mainly was an administrative office, is closing. It has been here for many, many years. This was here in Kigali, the field office. But the important message is that as far as the office of the prosecutor is concerned, we are maintaining the same number of investigators, prosecutors here, because we continue providing support to our prosecutors, colleagues here in Kigali. There are many cases still ongoing. You know, the Prosecutor General has still more than 1,000 fugitives at large in relation to the genocide committed against the Tutsi here in Rwanda. And we are helping the Prosecutor General in looking for those fugitives, updating some of the case files. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and it looks almost like, in terms of assistance, we have never been as busy as we are today.
So a lot to unpick there, but before we do that, let's have a look at the latest, the case of Kaishima. What is the delay? We know that the mechanism has done its work. All the major work has been done. You've identified all of this. All that remains is to get him in before a judge. So what is the delay?
Yeah, obviously, we had hoped after his arrest in May last year that proceedings would go faster, because at the end of the day, it's just a question of transfer of Kaishima to Arusha into the custody of the UN tribunal. South Africa, being a UN member state, has the obligation to cooperate with my office. So we had hoped that after a few months, so somewhere last year, he would have been transferred to Arusha. That's unfortunately not the case yet. We know that now in March, a number of court hearings are taking place. We are in contact with our colleagues, prosecutors in South Africa, but of course, it will be up to a judge to finally order his transfer. And we obviously hope that there will be progress to report in the weeks to come.
And all you can do is wait, essentially, until the South Africans decide to accede to your request, in a sense.
Yes. Basically, it's now with the judiciary. I know our colleagues, prosecutors in Cape Town, are making their requests to their judges, and we're waiting for a decision in this regard.
So that's one update, and we have your last case, which is the arrest and the trial, and then I don't know what one calls it, the stopping of the hiatus of the trial of Felicien Kabuga. What is happening now? We know that your responsibility in it is pretty much over and it's done. So what remains now? What's the status of his position?
Well, first, let me say again that obviously, as Office of the Prosecutor, we have tried until the last moment to have this case continuing, because I'm fully aware that it cannot be a satisfactory situation for any survivor or any victim of the crimes for which he was indicted. But well, the reality is what it is. The medical reports are there. The decision by the judges in first instance and appeals have been issued. And indeed, the defense is now looking for a country who would be willing to take him, where he would be provisionally released, while waiting if ever a change in his health situation would occur. But that's indeed not in the hands of the prosecutor. It is very much up to the judges to decide where ultimately he is going.
So administratively, you have no more say in what is happening now as the mechanism. It is who is now making the decisions, presumably between his lawyers and who else. And where is he now? Is he still in The Hague? Where is he now?
Yes, that's correct. He's still in The Hague. His defense is making démarches towards a number of countries, mainly where family members are living, to see if on humanitarian grounds they would be able and willing to take him on their territory, which so far was unsuccessful. My office is involved in the proceedings, but we are not in the driver's seat. It's really up to the defense to find a place and up to the judges to decide. Our position has been since the beginning, like with any other person arrested, convicted or acquitted or released, well, should go back to his or her country of origin, which should be Rwanda.
All right, so those are the latest cases. I would like to look, if I may, it would be rather interesting to look at your career within the international criminal justice, because when you began, you was at a time when these cases were new. So yours has been pioneering work in a way. You're also an academic. You lecture at universities. So that is interesting in the sense what you're teaching students about the evolvement of criminal justice. So could you tell us from when it started for you and how it felt from doing what you are doing already to something entirely different in a way in these incredibly difficult cases and that involves incredibly horrific crimes?
Well, where should I start? Career-wise, it was easy for me because from my first day at law school, I knew that I wanted to be a prosecutor. So since I'm 18, I know that I want to be a prosecutor, and it's now 35 years that I am in this job, right? I started when I was 26 in Belgium, in my home region, and then as a national coordinator for organized crime. And it's where in the late 90s I was for the first time confronted to international humanitarian law cases. And it's really such a big difference if you have worked on organized crime cases, international drugs trafficking, weapon trafficking, where there are some rules, moving to a genocide case, which is very difficult to understand and to comprehend from a human perspective how it is possible that individuals who were normal, if I may say, human beings become mass murderers within a very short period. So those were the first cases in the late 90s, where in Belgium we had the universal jurisdiction. So Belgium, I think, was one of the pioneers in prosecuting at the domestic level international crimes. And if I jump now 30 years later, I would say very much that I think the tendency today that international crimes need and will more and more be prosecuted at the domestic level, which is, by the way, the best place where they should take place, because having a prosecution taking place in the country where the crimes have been committed within a legal framework and a language and a legal system perpetrators and victims understand is always the option number one. Now, we know that this was not possible for the former Yugoslavia. It was not possible for Rwanda. In both countries, the countries were very much destroyed. There were no infrastructure. There were very few prosecutors, judges left. That's why In 93 and 94, the UN Security Council has set up those so-called ad hoc tribunals, which closed a few years ago, and where the Residual Mechanism is the successor organization. I think if one would look back today, obviously we have the International Criminal Court in The Hague with its successes and its failures, where the complementarity principle is really the basis. So the ICC can only come in if a country is unable or unwilling to prosecute domestically, which shows very much that today priority is given to domestic prosecutions and not to the International Criminal Court. But the two ad hoc tribunals were very, very different. It were the first ones created by the Security Council 45 years after Nuremberg, so after the Nuremberg trials were set up after the end of the Second World War. And definitely the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal have been absolutely instrumental in shaping international justice, the jurisprudence, in relation to armed conflict, in relation to genocide, in relation to sexual violence as a weapon of war. So obviously the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal have been, if you look at the short history of 50 years of international justice, have definitely been the most successful judicial initiatives, if I may say.
So I suggest that your work in a way has been pioneering in international criminal justice. And from what you say about the movement towards trying the cases domestically, you clearly come to a conclusion that would be the best thing. What I'm trying to look at is what has led you to think that is the best way of doing things.
You know, if you have trials taking place in The Hague or in Arusha, very often in a different language. In The Hague it was mainly in French and English, at the Rwanda Tribunal as well. You already have part of the communities affected who will not understand the proceedings. The ad hoc tribunals very much use the common law proceedings, where you have really long trials where everything has to be repeated in the courtroom, which is not very much the system Rwanda is using, or Belgium or Germany, the civil law countries we are much more used with. So I think it's very difficult for people to follow those proceedings which take years and years. And you know, justice is not just about getting a criminal, a war criminal or a genocidaire convicted. It is also for the victims, but also the family and the friends of the perpetrator to understand what happened and why it happened. Because the prosecution and the conviction is only one small part in the process. You still, as a society, need to move on and to give reconciliation a chance. And how can you move forward to a common future if you cannot agree on what was wrong in the past?
Well, that brings me to something that I think you've been especially placed particular emphasis, which is in a way narrowing the gap of understanding between international justice and the people that it affects. You've gone to greater efforts to meet the survivors, to talk to everybody. Talk to us a little bit about what you think, why you think it's important to have that link, and as I said, to narrow that gap, because international justice can seem far away.
You know, victims and survivors and the crimes they suffered are the reminders every day for us why the work we are doing is still important, even 30 years later. I think it's so important to listen to survivors and victims, to understand their emotions and what it meant in their life, because for many those are historical facts, right? Those are crimes committed 30 years ago. They turned their page, they moved on. But if you come to Rwanda today, this morning I had my meetings with Ibuka, well, it is present everywhere. The suffering is still present everywhere. And for someone who lost his or her loved ones 30 years ago, he or she is missing this person since then every single day of her or his life. This is always a message we are trying to give when we speak with the diplomatic community, with historians, or with anyone, to say, look, perhaps it's 30 years ago, but it's still today extremely relevant that we continue doing the work we are doing, because impunity cannot be an option.
So again, staying with this theme of the pioneering work, I mean, you start this work, and there are, as you mentioned earlier, clear rules on how you approach this. So in a way, you have to develop a way of doing these things. And now, if we look at your work on the Rwanda fugitives and the cases in Rwanda in particular, something changed when you started to, when you became the chief prosecutor. A lot more cases, for instance, were tried, and a lot more cases were investigated. Now, without asking you to make any comment on your predecessors, clearly there was something missing before you started doing whatever it is that you are doing. So could you explain what it is that you did that was different, that enabled the possibility to be able to get more of these people?
To go a little bit back in time, I took over the Yugoslav Tribunal in 2008 from Carla Del Ponte, and at that time the Yugoslav Tribunal was about to close, and President Karadzic and General Mladic were still at large. They were the two main fugitives at large, and everyone was afraid that the tribunal would close without those two major individuals being arrested, both being the architects of the genocide in Srebrenica, the siege of Sarajevo, and ethnic cleansing campaigns in many municipalities in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So we put a lot of emphasis on fugitive tracking. And myself, I'm a lawyer, but I've also done a master in criminology together with gendarmerie officers, which means that my mindset is very much on prosecution, but my passion have always been investigations also, right? And in the Belgian legal system, as a prosecutor, you're really directing investigations. So you are very much used to work with police officers, with analysts, with intelligence services. And so after our successes of the arrests in the former Yugoslavia, and when I was asked to take over the responsibility for the Rwanda tribunal, I was indeed wondering why for almost like 10 years no fugitive had been arrested, and we were reviewing the investigative methodologies which were used. And the conclusion was that in the early years after the genocide, it made sense that my predecessors were mainly working with witnesses, survivors, which could give fresh information about where the fugitives are or were. But when I took over, I could see that those were old so-called cold cases. There were no leads, and there were still informations coming in from so-called sources. But you know, they would say that Kabuga was seen in the same week in Kenya and in Mozambique and in whatever country. So we said, well, we really need to change the working methodologies. I brought a new team on board, with a new mind, much younger team, if I may say, much more trained into using analytical tools. So I put more emphasis on analysis and less on investigations. And we have done a lot of open source analysis, financial investigations, establishing movement of protocols of movements of persons of interest, and which allowed us for the different fugitives, those who have been able to arrest, or for those where we could conclude that they were not alive anymore, we really started to reconstruct their entire life from the moment they had fled after having been involved in committing the genocide up to their whereabouts today. So we identified always so-called persons of interests, former co-fighters or family members, and by zooming in on those networks, we have been able to find information in relation to those individuals which were not available before.
So in a way, really, that brings up a weakness within, at least as it was then. I don't know whether the methods you've brought in have been established as now the new methods, because otherwise I think it brings up a weakness within this way of doing things, in the sense that it depends very much on the chief prosecutor. If the chief prosecutor comes in like you and does an analysis of what has been happening and asks him or herself, why is this thing not moving, and changes things, then we have what we have, which is more cases in your case. Or if the chief prosecutor doesn't look at those things, there is no other mechanism around him or her to say, well, look, this ought to be happening quicker. Let's change our methodology. Because 10 years, as you say, is a long time without any kind of perceivable movement in getting the objective of the entire exercise done.
You know, it's a very complex issue. It's not black and white, right? The problem is that fugitives of international justice, if you don't know where they are, it's difficult to know where to look, right? They all are the subject of so-called red notices with Interpol. So if there is any country or the UN which is issuing an international arrest warrant, it goes into a database with Interpol, and if that individual which is the subject of the red notice is controlled or arrested somewhere, well, the person is arrested and sent to the country which is looking for this individual. Now, no one is really actively looking for those individuals. That's why we always thought that if we are not doing it ourselves, who will do it? You know, Kabuga was living for many years in France, but the French were not actively looking for him because they had no information allowing them to conclude that he was on their territory. South Africa, well, our fugitive Kaishima was living there for many years, but he was living there under different passports. So based on the identity he was using there, the South African authorities would not have concluded that he is the fugitive we are looking for. So what we have learned is that if you are not yourself very actively looking for the fugitives, no one will do. And this is really one of the major projects we are discussing this week with the Prosecutor General's office, as we have the privilege of having very experienced international analysts and investigators in the team. The Prosecutor General has asked us to help in tracing and tracking some of the main and major fugitives he is looking for. He has a list of more than 1,000 names. And what we are doing already for some weeks is really to determine together priority cases in relation to individuals which really played an important role and where there are strong case files. And we have already started locating some of the individuals the PG is looking for. We have started locating some of them. Some of them are living more or less openly. Others are hiding under fake identities. And the project we have together for the coming months, if not to say years, is really to approach those countries where the fugitives are hiding to say, look, he's hiding under fake identity in your country. There's an international arrest warrant. You have the international obligation to extradite this individual to Rwanda for prosecution. However, if ever, for whatever reason, legal reasons or other, you are not in a possibility to extradite him, like it is the case for France, where the jurisprudence of the Cour de Cassation doesn't allow the individuals to be transferred to Rwanda, well, in that case, we encourage third countries to prosecute themselves. And this is one of our new projects, is that then we can help this third country to have successful prosecutions. As we discussed over the last days with our French colleagues, to say, well, we know you have several dozens of investigations ongoing in France. There was a clear commitment by the chief prosecutor from Paris yesterday to say, well, we want to do more. So we are saying, you want to do more? Great, we can help you in achieving more results.
In a way, really, what you do and what you achieve and what you don't achieve as international justice, of course, affect the perception of international justice around the world, and people, victims and others and states. It is whether or not international justice is given the gravity, the regard that it should have. Now, in the case of Rwanda, as I say, I think one really does have to say that until your involvement, there has been a great deal of justifiable frustration with international justice. And I think in particular, when we look at the case of Judge Maron, who was the president of the International Mechanism, and releasing some of the worst offenders in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, early releases of these people, and he would just simply do it without asking anybody, and there was no stopping him because, of course, he's only answerable to the Security Council. And in a way, that's what I wanted to link, in the sense that either the chief prosecutor or the president of the court can just simply do these things without any kind of checks on them. And an awful lot of people who really should be in jail, at the very least, complete their sentences, were released by Judge Maron. And in a way, the mechanism may have a duty to say, well, we're sorry about this. That shouldn't have happened. You know? So I don't know, as somebody then who took over to try and pursue these cases, how you feel about it, and also how you might have felt if you had then gone to, say, you and your colleagues gone to the difficulty of arresting Kabuga, for instance, only to have somebody say, well, he can come out of jail 5 years or whatever earlier.
Well, there's one big first rule for any prosecutor is not to comment on any criticism towards judges, right? Judges have the final say in a case. We as prosecutors build cases, we do our investigations. Sometimes we are happy with the decision, sometimes we are not happy. If we can appeal, we appeal, but that's the system. But on the issue of early release in general, I have made it always very, very clear that I was absolutely not in favor of automatic early release. I knew early release systems from my own jurisdiction, but you would do only an early release if there are particular reasons, favorable reasons, which would justify that you shorten somehow the sentence of an individual. And as you know, when Judge Aegis took over and the current president, they very much look into still the issue of early release, but if it's done, it's not an automatic early release after 2/3 of the sentence, but it's a conditional early release. So they look at the specific circumstances, they consult the party to the proceedings, and they impose very often conditions like a public apology, like not contacting or interfering in any proceedings, like reparation or compensation. So I think it's totally normal that you consider early release in the cases under our jurisdiction as you do it at the domestic level, but there should be no automatism. It should always be merits-based, and that's the system which is used today, and I think it's a right system.
I mean, we have, I do understand that often from a layman's perspective, you might see something that is done legally and it seems absolutely strange. So for instance, somebody who, like Alo Simba, for instance, who was one of the people that was released by Judge Maron, found guilty of the murder of over 40,000 men, women and children, no remorse, didn't particularly cooperate that much with the prosecution, and he's given a release on what seems to be a rather trivial question that he's behaved well in prison. Well, these people, serious people who are clever people, they planned a genocide, that of course they're going to behave well in prison. That is no reason at all to release them. And from a layman's point of view, for a person like that to be released at all, let alone early release, seems odd in the extreme. So from a legal standpoint,
there's no automatic early release. Now, I still think that we want to show the difference between a judicial system which is showing humanity in front of individuals who have not shown any humanity when killing thousands of people without any remorse, right? I think it's important that as a society we're not coming over as vengeance. We put them in prison for the rest of their life and they have to die in prison. I think we have to show that humanity is much more than those criminals, because as I very often like to say, the survivors, the victims, are much more impressive as human beings, as personalities, and also in the courtroom than those perpetrators are, because when you see them in the courtroom, they were playing the powerful guys when they were committing the crimes, but they are very small human beings when they are sitting in the courtroom. And I think we as society should show the humanity they refuse to show.
Last point on this one, really. That is, I think, a perfectly understandable point. But you will correct me on this, because you will have done better research and deeper research in this than I have. But I don't know of any of the individuals in the Rwandan case who have shown real remorse. Indeed, many of them have gone on to write books recanting their original statements when they were being convicted. So in that sense, really, I suppose the most one should expect that at the end of their sentences, the judge handed down, they can be regrettably released, but early release shouldn't even be considered.
No one can look into the head and the brain of those individuals, right? And probably some of them were even not thinking that they were committing crimes when they were committing massacres, because they were thinking, well, that's how it is, and they were so much manipulated that they really thought that, well, the others do not deserve to live. Perhaps if at a certain moment in your life you have to recognize to yourself that you killed thousands and 10,000 of people, you have prevented entire families from growing, there would be thousands of other young people running around if you had not been committed those crimes. I think it's a difficult process for many of those perpetrators to recognize how wrong they have been when the crimes were committed, because this is still one of those aspects I have still, after 30 years as a prosecutor, difficult to understand. What must happen to a teacher, a police officer, a father of 4 children, who was having a normal life during 30 years, to become the next day a mass killer and to assassinate without hesitation people he has known for his entire life? What kind of manipulation must there have been to allow this to happen? And still, after so many years, I fail really to understand.
So in a way, really, I think, and you are in a position to make that suggestion because you've seen enough of these people, you've spoken to enough of these people. In a way, you're suggesting that for them to be able to accept the enormity of their crime is almost impossible. So it's a little bit better not to.
Yeah, it is definitely a problem. Also, we see it in the former Yugoslavia even more than here, that we see that many of the convicted politicians and generals in the former Yugoslavia are still today seen as heroes in their communities, getting decorations after having been released from prison, or ending up on lists of political parties, because some parties are so proud to have a convicted war criminal on their electoral lists. And I'm also wondering why would people be like this? They see in the courtroom images of soldiers executing prisoners, and the commander of those soldiers was convicted, and they still see him as a hero. And it's because people have difficulties accepting that they have been so much manipulated, and that they were following leaders which in fact were manipulating in such a way that they were accepting this kind of wrongdoing. I remember when I was a prosecutor in Brussels, one of my very first cases, I was reading the statement, I think it was in the case of Les Quatre de Boutaré, where there had been many hundreds of refugees, mainly women and children, who found refuge in a building near a church. And then the Interahamwe got information about it and went there with their machetes and grenades and started killing those individuals, like in so many different places in your country. And so they would enter in the morning, start the killings, would make a lunch break, and in the evening they would close the building, keep, of course, armed guards, would go home and would come to sleep, would come back the next day to continue doing, as they called it, their work, right? And I remember that we asked him, so you have a family? Yes, I have a wife and 4 kids. Okay. So you went killing women and children from the morning to the evening. You went home, you had dinner with your wife and your kids. You brought them to bed. You went to bed with your wife. The next day you are getting up, you say goodbye to your children, and you come back and you continue killing women and children. And you do this for 5 days. And his reaction was, yeah, I know 5 days is a long time. We could have done it in 3 days if people had been more cooperative. So he could not even understand that our question was, how can you, in God's name, as a father of children with a wife, kill other women and children? And he had not even understood. And he was speaking about, I'm going to work, and people were not cooperative. If not, I could have done my work much faster. So he could not even conceive what our question was. And I was really thinking, well, this is human being, once there is no social control, can become extremely dangerous.
A point of law which you can explain if you would. We hear of an all-life sentence. In other words, people are so awful, they've done such awful things that essentially they are sentenced to never get released. From a layman's point of view, it seems pretty obvious that people like, Kaishema, Simba, Bagosora, they should get all life sentences. Why even think 25 years? Why not life, meaning life?
Well, in fact, life sentence never means life sentence. In many countries, if someone is convicted to a life sentence, it's automatically changed into a number of years, into the maximum in that country. Can be 25 years, can be 40 years, but there's nothing like at the International Tribunal like a life sentence, which means you stay until you are dead. There's always this perspective for the individual to be perhaps released one day. But I fully understand your point of view, and you go to countries where there is still the death penalty, right? They would argue in saying, well, this is the best solution, where we, as I said, as humanitarian, we should really have a very different approach. Death sentence is not the solution, and keeping someone in prison until he dies is not the solution either. In many countries, there's a kind of corrective. If, for example, someone gets a life sentence, which is then commuted into 25 years, if this person at that time is still considered as a public danger to society, there are of course other forms to keep him in custody, depending on the country.
Let's state the obvious a bit, actually, because it may not be for some people. When they hear you're winding down the office and there are 1,000 people still remaining to be found, the residual mechanism for the criminal tribunals was specifically for the cases that had been tried in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and, of course, the former Yugoslavia. So that was your remit, and you cannot really go beyond that remit. Is that more or less what it is?
Well, in fact, the mandate of the residual mechanism has been, since its beginning more than 10 years ago, to finalize the remaining cases ICTY and ICTR have not been able to finalize, and to continue providing and supporting national jurisdictions. And we are now moving into this phase where there's only the support of national jurisdictions with this left. Of course, there are debates in New York Some countries are very supportive and think that it's important that we continue providing the support. Others are more reluctant. And what I'm trying in the Security Council, to the UN budget committees, to the European Union and everyone who wants to listen to us, I'm always saying, you know, the work the ad hoc tribunals have done for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, what the UN tribunals have done, with in total more than 250 persons indicted and prosecuted, well, this has only been one chapter of a much longer story, because if the international justice has done its work, well, we have to make sure that domestic justice is the second chapter, and this needs to be concluded successfully as well. So I'm always saying that ultimately the success of the ad hoc tribunals will also depend how the second phase is pushed forward, and this means that the impunity gap needs to be reduced even much more, because there are hundreds and hundreds of individuals who still are free out there, who have major responsibility for the crimes committed, and where we are committed to help the Prosecutor General here in Kigali to have them arrested and brought to justice.
So you've outlined how you're going to continue to work. So you'll be working with different prosecutors in different countries to pursue those cases. What nature of the relationship, in a way, I'm trying to understand, with a international tribunal, with a mechanism, you had a jurisdiction under international law, under the UN. What kind of jurisdiction will you have with the different national governments? I mean, can you only persuade, or can you insist that they do a little bit more, a little bit different? What kind of relationship will that be?
Well, it is obvious that the ad hoc tribunals, having been created under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, created an obligation for every single country on the world to cooperate with us. There was no alternative. And in relation to the former Yugoslavia, in relation to Rwanda, we always had primacy over the national jurisdictions, which means that we could take a case to Arusha or to The Hague, even against, if I may say, the will of the national authorities. So we always had priority over national jurisdictions. Now, obviously, we don't have any own cases anymore, so there's no priority over national jurisdictions anymore. And it is obvious that the cases where we are providing support are the cases of the Prosecutor General here in Kigali. It's up to him to decide how to move forward, and it's up to third countries to decide if they want to cooperate or not. But I think that the moral authority definitely is also still there. We have the mandate to facilitate cooperation. We have the mandate to ask third countries to cooperate with Rwanda. We have perhaps not the same pressure points anymore, like reporting someone for non-cooperation to the Security Council. But I think the legal principles are very clear. A country has the obligation under the Genocide Convention or to extradite to the countries where the crimes have been committed, or to prosecute themselves. And this is really the alternative we are helping the Prosecutor General to put before third countries. Send the individual to Rwanda, he will have a fair trial, or prosecute yourself and Rwanda and the mechanism. We will help you getting all the evidence necessary to have a successful trial.
But if, say, hypothetically, the Prosecutor General in Rwanda says to you, look, I'm having terrible difficulties with country A, would you help? I mean, the most you can do is persuade now.
Well, I mean, I'm still reporting every 6 months about our activities to the UN Security Council, and nothing would prevent my office to mention a country and to express my disappointment that a country is not providing the assistance which is urgently needed. So I think we still have a role to play, and you know, in the former Yugoslavia, for example, where you still have between Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, a lot of disagreements about many cases, I think we have a role to play as the objective observer who can have a very neutral analysis where local authorities very much have a very nationalistic view about things.
Let's look at generally now. What, in your view, is the state of international criminal justice, especially in relation to individual countries, countries in Africa, countries in Europe? I mean, we know, for instance, that the difficulties you found tracking down Felicien Kabuga, you might want to be diplomatic about it, but the reality is that individual countries got in your way quite a lot. You know?
Yeah.
So generally, how would you describe it, and what would need to change to make things a little bit better? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's true. I'm always trying to be diplomatic, right? And by just criticizing countries, you are not resolving your problems. You need to convince them to cooperate with you. Now, I don't think I will be undiplomatic if I'm saying that the world is not doing well. I don't think we had ever so many different crises and wars ongoing simultaneously. More than 60 million refugees around the world. Multilateralism is very much under pressure. Very difficult for Security Council and other international organizations to agree on basic principles. And obviously this has also an impact. If multilateralism in general has a problem, well, it has automatically an impact on international justice, because international justice is somehow the consensus of a number of countries to work together to bring justice to a certain conflict. And if we look at the world today, well, impunity is the rule and accountability is the exception. That's why I think if we look back, if we look at the 90s when the Security Council created those two tribunals, also probably because the international community has had a bad conscience, because both genocides could have been prevented. Like all wars, or the majority of wars could have been prevented if international community would have been worked better together. That's why I think if we look at the 90s, where the Security Council could agree, and if we look back at what the ad hoc tribunals have achieved, I think it's quite exceptional, and I'm afraid it will take many years more before there will be another international initiative which is so successful. Having said that, well, the International Criminal Court is there to stay. We hope that there will be other successes in the future, but there's also sometimes the tendency, when there is a big political problem somewhere, to send the hot potato to an international judicial institution, thinking or hoping that they would resolve the problem. I'm personally very much of the opinion that a political problem needs to be solved politically, and that accountability needs to come in a second phase. You should first resolve the conflict, and then look intensively into accountability.
As much as anybody else, you've now got some expertise on Rwandan justice. You've worked with them for a number of years, and you've had to do deep research about how they're working, how they do it. So let's have a look. Let's hear your summation of, first of all, the capacity and the willingness to fit into international justice systems, and what it is that you would wish that would make things perhaps better than they are at the moment. From
you mean at the domestic level? Yes. You know, you ask different persons, you will have different opinion about what people think about the legal system. And I think we can all agree that after the genocide, the entire system very much collapsed, like in everywhere in the world when there was a war. And of course, at the beginning, it was mission impossible. 10,000 of people being arrested, perpetrators. No national judicial system can cope with it. So I think that the system which was put in place ultimately in Rwanda, with on one hand the Security Council creating the Rwanda Tribunal for those so-called main responsible, having the national jurisdictions having in the late 90s their specific national jurisdictions where guilty plea played a very important role in relation to those different categories of cases, and then having the Gacaca trials taking place more than 1 million of them. I think at the end of the day, if we look backwards, it was far from perfect, but I don't see any better system at the end of the day than the interaction with the three levels, the international level, the national judiciary, and a more customary law approach where the perpetrator and the victims are put together at a more village level, if I may say. And of course, there has been an extremely important development in terms of the progress in the judiciary, training of prosecutors and judges, the reform of the criminal court. And 15 years ago, 20 years ago, countries were often reluctant to extradite individuals to Rwanda, being of the opinion, rightly or wrongly, that in a country which has suffered such an important genocide, is it really possible to have an objective justice? But the UN tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal, already 15 years ago decided to transfer the remaining cases we couldn't prosecute to Rwanda after a very thorough assessment about the judicial system and the rights of the defense. That's why the UN transfers those different cases. And today, I have in my team investigators and prosecutors from Rwanda, and they are functioning at the same quality level as prosecutors from Belgium, from the US, or from Australia. So it is obvious that the work quality, the level of knowledge today is of course of a totally different level than 20 years ago. Is it perfect? Definitely not. Is there still a lot to learn? Absolutely. And that's why we are, and that's why I really, really enjoy my cooperation with the Prosecutor General, because I've worked with many different countries, and very often in the former Yugoslavia and elsewhere, when we are saying, well, give me access to your cases and I will tell you what you could have done better, the majority of countries will say, no, we don't show. If I'm speaking with the Prosecutor General here, he is opening his books. He's saying, look, we want to learn from you. Here is what we have produced. What would you suggest to do it better? So we have now developed a system where when we are working on concrete cases and we identify aspects which could have perhaps have done differently, or if not to say better, well, we organize a training together explaining why we think that it could have been done differently. And this is really something I haven't seen very often in other countries, where the Prosecutor General is saying, well, I recognize that there are areas where improvement is possible. Help me to have this improvement realized.
30 years since the liberation of the country, Rwanda expects itself to be a little bit mature now. In the sector of justice, you've talked about that trajectory and that the reforms that have led us to where we are. But 30 years in a lot of ways is not a long period. I mean, countries that have had just systems that are many, many times older than that still have specific problems to iron out. So from your point of view, are the fundamentals in Rwanda there, or what would bring the fundamentals into place quicker if they're not there? Or are you simply saying that, well, there is a need for improvement, but it is moving in the right direction and it is heading where it's supposed to head?
It's definitely moving in the right direction. That's quite obvious. But it's always a question of resources, right? A question of priorities. I think the Prosecutor General Office has a quite important office, and there are a number of investigators and a number of prosecutors working on war crimes cases or on genocide cases, but it's never enough, right? I think this is also a problem the international tribunals have. When I was federal chief prosecutor in Brussels, right? You would have a hostage taking, you would have one child abducted. You put in place a task force of 20 people, 50 people, 100, who are day and night really looking for this one child. And you have all the resources you need. You are prosecuted at the international level. There's a major massacre committed somewhere with thousands of victims and hundreds of perpetrators, and you send a team of 5 individuals on the ground because that's the limited resources you have. And that's definitely, I would say, the most frustrating in our job is that we have to determine priorities, right? We have to decide which case are we taking. Are we taking this awful case or this other case which is even worse? Are we taking the case where you have a higher number of perpetrators, or the one where the link to the chain of command is even more important? So it's difficult for all international tribunals. The resources never match the challenge you are facing.
Let's end with this. We are 30 years since the liberation of Rwanda. A lot of people that were born in 1994 are now 30 years old. They consider themselves to be pretty mature now. You started round about that age in international justice. So some of those young people will be going into the law. Some of them already are lawyers. And some of them may want to go follow into your type of footsteps. They will be looking at what international criminal justice is, and inevitably they'll be looking at how it has performed in their country, whether or not it has failed their country, or whether or not it has done well for their country. And it will be the difference between whether or not they say this is something that inspires me to continue my passion, or something that they will feel a little bit cynical about. So what would you say to them?
Well, from a personal perspective, I would say it is an absolutely privilege to have the job we are having, because what greater privilege would there be than to be able to make a difference in the life of persons and to be relevant, right? All the jobs we are doing, you want to be relevant and to make a difference in the life of individuals. And I said it earlier, when we manage to get fugitives arrested and we see in the eyes of the survivors and the victims what this still means for them, this is the biggest reward as a prosecutor you can receive at the international level, but also domestically. Now, of course, we're always trying to motivate young lawyers to go into this field, right? And I'm speaking at many universities around the world about our experiences, and I'm trying to convince them that despite all the backlashes, despite all the problems international justice is having, despite all the fact that there are so many perpetrators who are still out there, some even perhaps in government, I'm always saying, look, you are taught at university that justice delayed is justice denied. Well, if we speak about international criminal justice, it's different. You need patience. You need to wait. Sometimes someone who is very powerful today, well, you have to wait until that person is not powerful anymore, and then you can have international justice coming into play. And you worked at, I worked at the domestic level, which I very much enjoyed. But my passion has always been international cooperation, mutual legal assistance, and working with different countries. And that's why one of the big advantages we have at the UN office, now my office is getting smaller, but at a certain moment I had 65 different nationalities in my team, coming from all different backgrounds in the world. And what I always try to explain to young lawyers, a young brilliant lawyer coming from Harvard, being so happy to join a UN office, I would also say to the Harvard student, look, what I need from you is 50% space in your head, in your brain, because you have to learn that what you think was or is a solution for a problem is perhaps a solution, but probably not. So you have to learn that there are many different ways of seeing things, and that there is much more to international justice than the law, just but the law, that is about contextual analysis, it's about cultural differences, it's about history, it's about religion, where all those different aspects need to come together in order to understand how a conflict started, and also try to understand how you can perhaps help a society moving forward to a better future.
And the last one, a difficult one for last. You may not really asking you to grade countries, but if one were to say to you, give out some prizes for countries that have made your work easier, where would you look at, and what would you say to others to do to be able to get that prize? That's
a difficult one. No, look, I've learned that you need to convince countries to cooperate with you. It's not happening automatically. When we had those issues with South Africa, right? It took 3 years before convincing the government to really cooperate with us. It was very frustrating. Several times in Security Council, I had to complain about the non-cooperation by South Africa. But at the end of the day, it is by meeting with the prosecutors there, meeting with the investigators, meeting with the Minister of Home Affairs, explaining what it is about, explaining that, or asking why would a country like South Africa, with their own history of apartheid, why would they help a genocidaire who allegedly is responsible for the killing of more than 2,000 women and children? Why would you help him escaping justice? And at the end of the day, I think we have been able to convince our interlocutors to do the right thing. And last week I was in Mozambique. I went to thank the Attorney General of Mozambique for the help of his team. And a few months ago we went to Eswatini, because at the end of the day we have been able to convince Eswatini and Mozambique to put in place also task force, which were helping us getting our fugitives. And as I said, shouting at countries, blaming countries, trying to put pressure, at the end of the day is not helping. You have to convince them that helping us is the right thing to do, and that's what at the end of the day led to the arrest of our remaining fugitives.
Dr. Brammertz, thank you very much indeed for being so generous with your time.
My pleasure.